Greetings from the United News of Bangladesh. This is Nahar Khan, and it gives me enormous joy to welcome you all to our webinar on building on the outcomes of COP26, priority climate actions ahead of COP27. The climate crisis is an existential threat posed to our planet, in which Bangladesh happens to be a frontline state. I bid a very warm welcome to our distinguished panel of discussants who have joined us today to deliberate on this very critical issue. Additional Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Mr. Mizanul Chowdhury, His Excellency, Mr. Robert Chatterton Dickson, British High Commissioner to Bangladesh, Professor Saleemul Huq, Professor Mizan Khan, and Dr. Hasib Irfanullah. We'll be taking a close look at the UN-led process that acts as the global response in tackling the climate crisis that is currently being chaired by the United Kingdom. The pandemic has served up a 2-year snapshot of what many climate scientists have been warning us for years: mass casualties, economic disruption, and a generation set adrift as we're challenged to confront a new reality. Climate change is already impacting every corner of the world, and much more severe impacts are in store if we fail to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and immediately scale up adaptation. COP26 was eventually held last November following a year's delay due to the pandemic. But thanks to the wise approach adopted by the UK as hosts, a number of incremental steps were achieved that we can build upon in the run-up to COP27. If we look at the Glasgow Climate Pact, it strongly affirms to prevent global warming of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. COP26 gave us much to work with, and perhaps more than ever before, it gave us the opportunity and a responsibility to reach important milestones in the negotiations that take place between each conference. Bangladesh is one of the countries most vulnerable to climate change. According to the Environmental Justice Foundation, by 2050, with a projected 50-centimeter rise in sea level, Bangladesh may lose approximately 11% of its land, affecting an estimated 15 million people in its low-lying coastal areas. UNB, as the country's leading independent news agency, has been reporting on the plight of these communities for close to 40 years, and we remain committed to continue doing so. We have increased our coverage of our coastal communities' reliance on homespun techniques that are increasingly being studied worldwide as part of the literature on adaptation. Last September, UNB joined World News Day, the climate crisis, with 2021 being declared as the hottest year on record, aiming to highlight the importance of credible climate journalism in providing trustworthy information about the climate crisis and the planet's future. UNB also works closely with its sister concern, Wild Team, which is dedicated to nature and wildlife conservation in Bangladesh, to deliver scientifically accurate reporting on issues around conservation. We would now like to share a video of His Excellency Mr. Alok Sharma, British Cabinet Minister and COP26 President during his visit to the Sundarban and Wild Team Center in 2021.
Here we are in Bangladesh in the Sundarbans. This is almost 10,000 square kilometers, covering a large part of the area is in Bangladesh, the other part in India. And we're just seeing the really positive impact that these mangroves have, both in terms of biodiversity, capturing carbon dioxide emissions, but also protecting communities from the ferocity of typhoons when they come through. And hearing the stories about the work that is being done by the tiger team to ensure that tigers are protected at the same time as the humans are protected in the villages. And the aim is to ensure that nature can be at one with humans as well. And it is really quite spectacular, and you have to be here to really experience this. But right in the middle of the mangroves, with some rain coming down, and seeing the incredibly lush vegetation that is here. It's an absolute honor to be able to visit something like this. And of course we should be doing everything we can to preserve these sort of mangroves and this sort of biodiversity. It's quite remarkable, really quite remarkable.
Without further ado, I would now like to welcome our first speaker today, Mr. Mizanul Huq Chowdhury, Additional Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, and National Project Director of National Adaptation Plan Formulation Project of Bangladesh to make his deliberations. Mr. Chowdhury.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. His Excellency Robert Chatterton Dickson, British High Commissioner to Bangladesh, Professor Climate Expert, Professor Saleemul Huq, and Climate Expert, Dr Nahar Khan, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. A very good morning to you all. It's my pleasure to join you all in this webinar on building on the outcomes of COP26, priority climate actions ahead of COP27. Excellencies, human-induced climate change is already creating many weather and climate extremes, not only in developing countries, but in every region across the globe, irrespective of developing or developed countries. Being one of the hardest hit by climate change-induced disaster, ranked 7th among the most vulnerable countries in the world, the COP27 was very crucial for the future progress of the people of Bangladesh. Earlier, ahead of COP26, we submitted and modeled ambitious NDC to the UNFCCC on 26 August 2021. And you know that we are formulating the National Adaptation Plan. In NDC, we have increased our quantified ambition reduction target from 15% to 21.85% below the business as usual level by 2030. It is conditional and unconditional, and adopted a whole of economy approach covering all greenhouse gas emitting sectors as per the IPCC guidelines. Distinguished guests, Bangladesh joined the COP26 under the able and dynamic leadership of our Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina and made the demands on obligatory submission of ambitious NDC by the major emitter countries. Secondly, fulfillment of the developed countries' commitments of providing $100 billion per year. Third, transfer of clean, green, and advanced technology to the most vulnerable developing countries. Fourth, addressing the issue of loss and damage. And the last, the requirements of a common global commitment for leaving a healthier planet for our future generation. Ladies and gentlemen, with the able leadership of the COP26 presidency, UK delegates from 197 parties forged agreements and adopted the Glasgow Climate Pact, aiming to strengthen ambition in collective climate actions in this decade. The package of decision consists of a range of agreed items, including strengthened efforts to build resilience to climate change, to curb greenhouse gas emissions, and to provide the necessary finance for the both adaptation and mitigation. Parties welcomed the recent pledge made to the Adaptation Fund, totaling USD 351.6 million, and to the LDC countries fund, totaling 605.3 million. How about the developed countries? In action in deliver of US 100 billion to developing countries has been noted with deep regrets. Ad hoc work program agreed for setting up a new collective quantified goal from 2022 to 2024 under the CMA. The parties recognized that the impacts of climate change will be much lower as the temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius compared with 2 degrees Celsius, and resolve to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But it's also agreed that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius requires rapid, deep, and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions, including reducing global carbon dioxide emissions by 45% by 2030 and to net zero by 2050. For the first time, nations are called upon to phase down unabated coal power and inefficient subsidies for fossil fuels. A loss and damage functions of Santiago Network agreed. Santiago Network will be supported by a technical assistance facility to provide financial support for technical assistance. As part of the package of decisions, nations also completed the Paris Agreement's rulebook as it relates to market mechanism and non-market approaches and the transparent reporting of climate actions. Respected participants, yet we have a long way to go. Delivering the promised $100 billion by the developed countries is a matter of building trust among nations for further fruitful climate negotiations. We have to work with the elements of new quantified finance, which need to be at least doubled of the $100 billion ceiling, along with a transparent and efficient tracking mechanism. Developed countries and larger emitting nations must update their NDC with more ambitious mitigation targets before COP27 to reduce the gap between existing emission reduction plans and what is required to reduce emissions so that the rise in the global average temperature can be limited to 1.5 degrees. And it is our goal to keeping the global temperature 1.5. The objective of the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program need to be finalized to operationalize the global goal on adaptation. The governance issues of Santiago Network and a specific financing window for loss and damage need to be addressed, ensuring climate justice to the most affected climate frontier people. I appreciate His Excellency, the British High Commissioner, UNB, for organizing this webinar, and also appreciate the audience for their kind patience. I thank you all. Joy Bangla.
Thank you, Mr. Chowdhury, for your very insightful deliberations and for your valuable time today. Now it gives me much pleasure to introduce His Excellency Mr. Robert Chatterton Dickson, British High Commissioner to Bangladesh, who has been serving here since March 2019. High Commissioner Dickson has had an impressive career as a UK diplomat. Earlier, he served in key positions both in FCO in London and in British missions overseas. His posts abroad included ambassadorship to Macedonia and being Deputy Chief of Mission in Kabul. Prior to joining the service in 1990, he was an analyst at Morgan Grenfell & Co. in the City of London. Excellency, a warm welcome to you. We now invite you to make your address.
Well, thank you very much, Nahar, and good morning to all the distinguished participants in this panel. I have to say I'm having intermittent connectivity issues, but they seem to resolve themselves quite quickly. So if I disappear, I hope it won't be for more than about 30 seconds, but I appreciate that for everyone that will be very annoying if it happens. So I apologize in advance. What I would say is, very grateful to you in UNB for organizing this webinar, because climate, although we are obviously all horrified by some of the developments that are taking place in geopolitics at the moment, and particularly Russia's illegal and unprovoked war on Ukraine, I think it's worth remembering what we achieved in November last year when the countries of the world gathered in Glasgow for COP26. And after 2 years of marathon work and a 2-week sprint of negotiations, we were able to achieve our aim, and almost 200 countries gathered in Glasgow were able to achieve the Glasgow Climate Pact. Now, clearly, it wasn't perfect. There was always more we can do. Climate is an existential issue for all of us. But we were able to achieve this historic agreement with 197 signatories. And I think we can credibly say that we did keep in reach our overall goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. So we were able to keep the target intact, but clearly there's now an enormous amount of work to do to follow up. And I think you're absolutely right to be focusing on the priority climate actions that we all need to be taking before COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in now just 8 months' time. But I do think, as I said, that there is a real sense of hope from what we were able to achieve at COP26. And in particular, the growth of trust between nations and a real determination to reach agreement despite the fractured geopolitics and despite the enormous scale of the task in front of us. And there's no question for us in the UK that the Climate Vulnerable Forum, led by the Honourable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, played an enormously important role in Glasgow in shining the spotlight on the urgency of tackling climate action for vulnerable nations and a crucial role in raising global ambition. And we obviously very much hope that that Bangladeshi input into the negotiations and discussions will continue, because I think Bangladesh is an enormously credible and important voice in this space. As you all know, the Glasgow Climate Pact commits countries to plan to move away from coal power and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And after 6 years of discussion, it finalises the outstanding elements of the Paris Rulebook, which govern the Paris Agreement on climate change signed in 2015. So it's an enormously important moment in the implementation of the Paris goals. And it also made progress on finance for climate action, on adaptation to protect people and nature from the effects of climate change, and on loss and damage resulting from the climate crisis. Now, I appreciate that not everyone on this panel necessarily feels that we went far enough, but I think it's worth bearing in mind how far we did come, because these are all vital issues in the fight against climate change. And the key thing, I think, now for all of us as we look ahead for the next few months through COP27 and indeed COP28 in the United Arab Emirates beyond that, it's really important to make sure that these commitments are now turned into action on the ground. And that means being even more ambitious in revised nationally determined contributions, which we will all be putting forward at COP27 this year. And in the case of Bangladesh, I'm very encouraged that the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change is drawing up a strategy to implement the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use, which commits signatory countries to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. And that's obviously an enormous important issue in Bangladesh as it is elsewhere. And I'm also pleased to hear that Bangladesh is already working on a revised nationally determined contribution, because it's really up to all of us now to protect and strengthen the gains that we made at COP26. And I think if we look ahead at what might be possible for countries that were not able to make a net zero announcement at Glasgow, we very much hope that a net zero announcement will become a possibility as we look ahead in the future and towards COP27. And we continue to look forward to the Bangladesh National Adaptation Plan, which sets out which we hope will set out far-reaching and transformative adaptation measures. And the recent publication from the Intergovernmental Panel reminds us we all have an enormous amount to do, but focused on adaptation at least as much as on mitigation. And really, we feel as COP26 president, our work began in Glasgow. And of course, there was an enormous amount of work by the COP president designate leading up to Glasgow. And it was very nice to be reminded at the beginning of the forum about his really remarkable visit to Bangladesh in June of last year. But we're going to be working with others to take action and honour promises which were set out in the Glasgow Climate Pact to increase climate ambition. And we will be providing technical. And I'd just like to end by looking at what we'll be doing here in Bangladesh as the UK, both in our presidency role, but also using climate and taking the part of climate as an enormously important component of the overall bilateral relationship, which is so strong between Bangladesh and the UK. So as we announced at COP, we will be providing £120 million between 2021 and 2027 for the Bangladesh Climate and Environment Programme, which will do a whole range of things, including help scale up locally led adaptation, where Bangladesh has so much to teach the world, expand renewable energy, which at the moment is a small part of Bangladesh's overall energy mix, but clearly could become a much more important part of that mix, and will need to do so if an ambitious NDC is going to be reached. Tackle pollution and waste, which I think anyone who lives in Dhaka or visits major cities in Bangladesh can see as an issue where there's considerable change that needs to happen. And also develop and empower the next generation of climate leaders, because one of the many great things about the issue of climate in Bangladesh is the extraordinary degree of engagement by young people particularly, and by civil society organizations. And we'll be working with partners here to try and develop that and build on that very strong foundation. And I've no doubt that UNB will continue to be part of that. We'll also be supporting the Global Centre of Adaptation Office, which has now been established here in Dhaka, to make sure that we take lessons in adaptation from people on the front line, including in Bangladesh, and scale them up across South Asia and in other parts of the world. And we'll be facilitating exchanges of expertise between the UK and Bangladesh, which aims to strengthen the mutual learning and evidence gathering, which is already a strong part of our relationship to tackle the common threat. So this remains an enormously important part of our overall global work, but also an important part of what we do as the UK High Commission here in Bangladesh. And I'm very grateful to you at UNB for organising this panel, very grateful to the distinguished people who have agreed to take part, and look forward to hearing from them with more of the detail of what we need to be doing. But thank you very much for the opportunity to speak this morning, and look forward to hearing what others have to say. Dhanyavad.
Thank you, Excellency, for your very insightful and illuminating address. You continue to work actively during your tenure in Bangladesh, and we are very grateful for that. So thank you. Our next discussant, Professor Saleemul Huq, is the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development and professor at Independent University, Bangladesh. Professor Huq is an expert in the field of climate change, environment, and development, who has attended all Conference of the Parties and provided training to the LDC negotiators. He was awarded 2020 National Environment Award by the Government of Bangladesh for his contribution to the development of the environment, and was appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire for services to combating international climate change. Professor Huq, we welcome you to make your remarks.
Thank you very much, Nahar, and congratulations on putting together this wonderful panel. So I will make three sets of remarks. Firstly, about the COP26 outcome, and then how do we take that forward. Secondly, about the actual impacts of climate change, which are now a reality around the world, and that supersedes talking about it at the COPs. We have to deal with it in reality. And thirdly, about possible avenues of further collaboration, building on a very strong foundation between the UK and Bangladesh to tackle climate change. So the first set of remarks around COP, which has already been alluded to by the previous speakers, is we had a very good meeting. Bangladesh was represented at the highest level possible by the Honorable Prime Minister, not just speaking for Bangladesh, but speaking on behalf of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which she chairs. When she went to Glasgow, there were 48 countries in that forum. When she came back for Glasgow, there were 55 countries in that forum. So it shows that the forum has gathered encouragement from other countries to join it and is seen as a very positive political forum. Her term will be ending later this year. She'll hand over to the president of Ghana, who will then lead the group going into COP27. But Bangladesh's role does not end there, because Bangladesh remains a part of the Troika, which is the governing system of the CVF, for Ghana's term for 2 years, and then the further 2 years of whoever takes over from Ghana. So Bangladesh remains in the troika of the governing system of the Climate Vulnerable Forum for 4 more years, even though we will relinquish the chair of that position. So a very important body for us to be continuing to work with as we go forward. One of the aspects of the COP26 that the High Commissioner, His Excellency, has alluded to is the fact that the COP26 presidency has not ended in Glasgow. It, if anything, has begun anew in Glasgow with the Glasgow Pact to be implemented and taken forward. And he will only, the current president, Mr. Alok Sharma, will only end his tenure when he hands over to the incoming COP president designate from Egypt at the beginning of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November this year. So there are still many, many months of actions to be done on the brief of the COP26 presidency, and I'm absolutely sure they're aware of that. I will just mention one or two things that are, I believe, of great importance where the COP26 presidency will have a very important role to play. The first one is in implementing the Glasgow decisions on loss and damage. There were two decisions on loss and damage. The first decision was to create, set up, and get it up and running as quickly as possible, something called the Santiago Network on loss and damage. This is a very good development, a very excellent outcome of the Glasgow discussions. We need to take that forward. There's going to be a workshop on that during the subsidiary body meeting of the UN Framework Convention in June in Bonn. We hope that will be a good meeting that will take us forward, and by COP27, the Santiago Network can be up and running. That is really the test. How quickly can we get it up and running, and how long do we just have to talk about doing things rather than just doing things? So that's the first challenge. The second one is the Glasgow dialogue on finance for loss and damage. This is something of a disappointment, I must say, because the Climate Vulnerable Forum countries under the leadership of Honorable Prime Minister of Bangladesh actually asked for a Glasgow facility on finance for loss and damage. That facility text was in the text of the draft Glasgow Agreement, but was downgraded to a Glasgow dialogue instead of a Glasgow facility at the last minute at the behest of a number of developed countries who did not want to create the Glasgow facility in Glasgow. That was a certain disappointment for many of the vulnerable countries. Nevertheless, we have the dialogue. Incidentally, the dialogue is a 3-year-long dialogue. And so our expectation is not that we talk for 3 more years before we do anything. We need to be doing things while we talk. And that is the responsibility of the COP26 presidency, to ensure that we have a fruitful dialogue. Right now, we have no idea what that dialogue is going to consist of, how it's going to be held, where it's going to be held, when it's going to be held, who's going to be invited to it. So I would ask His Excellency to try and find out from the COP26 presidency and let us know. I would be very interested in participating in that if there is an opportunity to participate. So far, I haven't been able to find out if there is such an opportunity or not. And so we hope that that dialogue will actually lead to something more substantive than just talk, 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 as Greta says, blah, 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 which it is if all we do is talk. And so that is a very important element that the COP26 presidency has the responsibility to hand over to the COP27 incoming presidency for something to happen in Egypt at COP27 beyond simply talking about it. All right, we just cannot continue to talk about loss and damage and do nothing. Let me move on to my second area of discussion, which is predicated on the recent report in the last few days of Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has some very, very important messages. The first most important message is that climate change is already happening. So losses and damages from climate change are already happening. They're reality on the ground in every country in the world, not just in Bangladesh or in the developing world, but even in the rich world. And so we're going to have to deal with it, whether we like it or not, whether we recognize it as human-induced or not. The impacts are happening. We are going to have to deal with them. And we need to get our act together, and we need to adapt as quickly as possible. So main message from the IPCC is adaptation needs to be redoubled, support for adaptation needs to be redoubled, and we need to be much more at speed on doing adaptation. And again, not just in developing countries, but in all countries, including the rich countries. However, there is an obligation from the rich countries, which they accept, and they have announced, and they have pledged to redouble their adaptation funding, which they made that pledge in Glasgow. We hope they will keep that pledge. And so enhancing finance for adaptation in developing countries is something that we need to think of. But there's a more nuanced message in the IPCC report, which I would recommend people who are interested to read. It's a huge report, by the way, so just the headlines is an insufficient way of understanding it. On the adaptation, the lead authors who studied the adaptation now have quite a body of evidence and papers, scientific papers in the many hundreds available to assess our experience of investing in adaptation. And one of those assessments that we have found, and they have found, and they have highlighted, is that not all of it has been successful. There are very significant instances of adaptation funds, projects, activities that have led to maladaptation, the opposite of what was intended. That's not right. That's not good. We need to do better. And so just putting more money into doing more of the same is not what we need. We need more money, but we also need to do something different, learn from our mistakes, and don't repeat those mistakes. And that's something very, very important to remember as we go forward. And I'll just mention one of the elements that they identified as causing this maladaptation. That element is a very, very top-down approach by the global community of experts and national experts, thinking that they know what adaptation is, thinking that they know what is best for the people, coming with a lot of money, with a lot of top-down ideas of what needs to be done, and telling people to implement what they think is right, and then finding out that it doesn't get implemented, or if it does get implemented, it doesn't really work very much. And the missing link is the people were not consulted. The vulnerable people themselves who are feeling the pinch of climate change have a lot of knowledge that we need to be building on and supporting, and not just telling them what they have to do because we know what's best for them, which is the paradigm that we have been applying so far. So international banks, the FCDO, bilateral agencies, all the global experts fly into a developing country, tell them what they need to do, give them a bunch of money, and it didn't work. All right, so this is something, a big lesson that we need to take on board. And as many of you will know, one of the areas that we work on in Bangladesh is particularly good at is locally led adaptation, getting local people to be part of that decision making, both at the planning stage, at the implementation stage, and indeed even at the monitoring and effectiveness evaluation stage. So a very important element in how to do adaptation versus not just doing more of the same of what we've been doing in the past. And my third and final set of remarks is to build on a very well-established and historic relationship between the UK and Bangladesh in my area of work, which is academia, research, universities. Many of us have studied in the UK. I can see Hasib here is also a graduate and did his PhD in the UK. I did mine at Imperial College. And there are many dozens of academics in Bangladesh who did their PhDs and studies in the UK, have very good relationships. And over the years, we have established quite a substantial body of collaborative research between academics and researchers in Bangladesh and the UK on poverty and development before, in the past, increasingly now climate change as well. But the way these have been done has been very ad hoc. We apply for a grant here and a grant there, and we do a piece of work here and a piece of work there. It didn't really add up to what it should have added up to, which is much more than the sum of the parts. My request, therefore, is in the new funding that the FCDO is now placing before our Bangladesh for our looking at and developing our further ties. Can we build on that relationship and foundation of collaborative research and researchers to now have a much more strategic outcome for the next 5 years of supporting research, collaborative research between academics and researchers in the UK and Bangladesh on the twin goals, and these are global goals, not just Bangladesh goals or UK goals, the twin goals of tackling climate change and poverty at the same time. This is really the issue of the globe of today, poverty and climate change. We can do them both. And Bangladesh and the UK have a lot of knowledge and experience that can be combined together for the global good. These are global outputs for global, information for the next IPCC report, for example, for us to generate. If we do it strategically rather than in an ad hoc way. Right now, we're doing it, but we're doing it very ad hoc. And I would like to propose to the High Commissioner in particular and his colleagues in FCDO that we try and design a more strategic 5-year program of collaborative research between the UK and Bangladesh to tackle the twin threats of climate change and poverty globally. We will do it as two countries, but we will do it for the global good. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Huq, for your pertinent points, which have been most incisive and insightful. Our next speaker, Professor Mizanul Khan, has a PhD in environmental policy and management from University of Maryland School of Public Policy and is the Deputy Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development. He was also an adjunct professor at the Natural Resources Institute, University of Manitoba, Canada, and has been a visiting professor at Brown University, USA. Before joining as chair of the Department of Environmental Science and Management at NSU, he served as UNDP Environment Policy Specialist. He has also been attending the UN Framework Convention and climate change as the lead negotiator on climate finance with the Bangladesh delegation. Professor Khan, we are pleased to have you here and we welcome you to make your deliberations.
Already the contracts have been set by the previous speakers. As I have been attending, as Madam Nahar has mentioned, about 20 years ago, and dealing with climate finance, but I'm getting tired. I got tired of talking about climate finance, which our Additional Secretary, Mr. Mizan, and Dr. Saleem also have referred to. But initially, I will mention a few points on climate finance, and then I will deal a little about the global politics and economics of climate change. You know, climate finance is the most intractable issue, which in fact causes extension of almost every COP now for the last few years. We have 2 weeks of negotiations, but because of climate finance indecision, always COP is extended just for a day or 2. We expect that Sharm el-Sheikh will not face this problem. Climate finance, you know, as our additional secretary referred to about the quantified goal of $100 billion. But now this 100 billion euro, which British Prime Minister Gordon Brown has raised back in October 2009 at the Cape Town Commonwealth Conference, as I remember, then the British Foreign Secretary, Lady Foreign Secretary, took up as $100 billion instead of euro. And now, over a decade, if we calculate the inflation rate, for example, then those $100 billion has gone down way down. And now still we are further away from this goal. Real climate finance is about $25 to $30 billion. Oxfam has shown in their reports, though the OECD report claims that about $79 billion has been delivered, but there is a huge Himalayan gap between the claimed delivery and the actual receipts on the ground. That is why the heart of the issue lies at the lack of definition of climate finance, because there is huge creative accounting based on the Rio markers. Developed countries use their individual discretion, and where this constructed ambiguity as a diplomatic resource is applied, depending on the individual national self-interest. This is what is the problem. And we know that both the quantity and quality are not at a satisfactory level at all. Now, talking about the quality of climate finance, in fact, you know, even for the LDCs now, this climate finance comes in the form of loans. More than 2/3 comes as loans. This is double injustice because we are innocent victims. The Working Group 2 report of the R6 has clearly shown that what UN Secretary General has mentioned about the atlas of human suffering, but still we are forced to take loans. This is kind of some injustice beyond imagination.
And then we have increasingly climate finance and ODA are qualitatively different. ODA is kind of enlightened charity, what we call. Depending on the political expediency of developed countries, they commit each year some kind of assistance to the developing countries, particularly for the provision of the SDGs. But climate finance is kind of an obligation under Article 4.3, 4.4, 3.1 of the Convention and Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. Developed countries have assumed obligatory responsibility with the language shall support. But still, and the basic principles are new and additional, adequacy and predictability. These are the 4 principles of climate finance, but still those are not respected. And the problem is that the developed countries still look at the global politics of climate change from the pure individual national interest perspective. But this is a global problem, global commons problem, where collective action and collective solutions are needed. And that is not respected. Still, we live in a world, Westphalian world, about 300 years back, where this European state system has been formed, and national sovereignty and territorial integrity are the main concerns of maintaining independence of a nation. But we live in a world of 21st century. Here, national interests must be put on an enlightened framework, which we are not achieving yet. Another problem is, as I mentioned, ODA and climate finance are qualitatively different, but now increasing amount of ODA is delivered as climate finance because we have better mutuality of interest. The tragedy is ODA goes down, overall global ODA goes down now, but climate finance, we are having some increase in climate finance. So this is kind of a double injustice. Starting from 1970, you know, there is a gentleman's agreement that 0.7% of the GNI of the developed countries will be delivered as aid to the developing countries. But globally, still, we are less than half of it. But some developed countries have crossed that limit, led by Sweden, which provides about 1.21% of GDP. We feel very sorry that UK, as the leader of climate diplomacy, has now, has gone down in their commitment from 0.7%, which they have committed to back in 2013. And now they have decided to go for 0.5% of their yearly income as ODA. So this we need to look at. So when we talk of climate finance nowadays, we need also to think together with the ODA. This is another point. Then now I will focus a little further on the climate diplomacy, on politics and economics of it, global. We find a serious disconnect between the global climate science and the climate policy, both internationally as well as nationally. Huge disconnect. And this disconnect continues because of one basic biological problem we human beings have. Biologically, we human beings respond to the immediate concerns, to weather, not climate. Climate is a decadal issue, at least the average temperature of 2 to 3 decades. And that is what is not considered by this, particularly the citizens and the political leaders of the developed countries who must take lead. This is one thing. So our responsibility should be to make climate risks visible so that the citizens feel the pain of it. The countries feel the pain of it, and they are feeling the pain of it. Germany, for example, has witnessed about 200 deaths just a few months back. So, and everywhere this is happening. America also is being inflicted very heavy casualties nowadays. And the politics, as I have mentioned, we need to put global climate diplomacy is different from other kind of diplomacies where national interests get precedence over the collective interest, certainly. But climate change is a global problem. It's a survival, as Madam Nahar has mentioned rightly, that it's an existential threat. We cannot deny it anymore. It's a fact of life. And where economics comes in a big way, For example, still our mainstream model is based on the net present value, which only prefers investment for near term. And our businessmen don't invest in something where benefits come a little longer. That is where we need to kind of think of collectively of imposing a social discount rate in climate investments. This is something very urgent that I feel. Otherwise, we cannot have any decision. And based on that, from the LDC perspective, I can tell that we started at the convention time back in '92 with better sense of climate justice. But now we are, though climate convention is based on neoliberal justice and market principles, but still we are moving further and further away from those basic climate justice. Now we are moving further to market justice, for example, neoliberal market justice. And market justice favors the stronger ones who have market power. But we, from developed country citizens, developing country citizens, and the LDCs, we don't have that kind of market power. That is why private sector cannot, do the job of solving this collective problem. Private sector certainly will be needed for making their investments more resilient and climate resilient. But for solving collective action problem, we need international public finance, where we always argue that we need to apply the polluter pays principle, and based on these industrial countries apply the polluter pays principle within their territory. But because emissions straddle across the borders, they don't stay put within their borders. So developed countries and now the major emitters from developing countries also don't care. But earthly waste dump, for example, in industrial countries is extremely costly because that condemns the citizens to suffer. But climate emissions straddle beyond their borders, they don't stay put. So this kind of no compliance of the assumed obligations that developed countries have assumed under the convention. So this is what I wanted to share. Thank you very much, Madam Nahar.
Thank you, Professor Khan, for your thought-provoking remarks today. Our next and final speaker, Dr. Hasib Irfanullah, has evolved from being a botanist to an aquatic ecologist to a conservationist and a development practitioner. Over these years, he has developed interest and understanding of climate change adaptation, disaster risk management, natural resource management, biodiversity conservation, and environmental governance. Dr. Irfanullah, we welcome you to make your remarks.
Thank UNB for inviting me and making me part of this fantastic panel. I have been eagerly listening to my fellow panelists, but when I have been thinking of how to build the outcomes of COP26, I'm in a dilemma. As a conservationist, I'm very much excited that Glasgow Climate Pact has repeatedly mentioned nature conservation, biodiversity conservation, not for climate change adaptation, but also mitigation. But as a person who has been repeatedly seeing the failures of COPs taking decisions, major, decisive, meaningful decisions, or complying with those decisions between COPs, I'm quite frustrated, as many of my fellow colleagues. Nevertheless, as a Bangladeshi, I'm very proud of seeing Bangladesh creating and setting examples. Take it 2009's Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan, or 2010, the establishment of the Trust Fund, leading the LDC at the COPs, and more recent times, as Dr. Huq elaborately mentioned, Bangladesh's leadership or presidency at Climate Vulnerable Forum, which in fact Bangladesh is representing 1.3 billion people, climate vulnerable people. Over the last 5 years or so, Bangladesh is preparing its climate budget. In 2018, we developed a 80-year-long Delta plan, which is fantastic, making our Delta resilient. And finally, in September, we drafted the Muji Climate Prosperity Plan, which was a highly, which was very much appreciated in the Glasgow COP as well. But these proud moments or these examples doesn't mean anything when we already know for sure that my fellow Bangladeshis on the ground, they are losing, they are investing, they are spending $2 billion every year just to tackle climate change. IIED's study showed that. So I see COP27 gives Bangladesh opportunity in 3 interconnected areas, and over the next 5-6 minutes, I will be talking about those. Dr. Huq has highlighted that the first point I'm trying to make. Although the leadership or the presidency of Bangladesh ends in June when we talk about Climate Vulnerable Forum's presidency, but it doesn't end there, isn't it? As Dr. Huq very clearly mentioned. And at the COP26, we showed our Prime Minister, Honorable Prime Minister, has shown tremendous leadership and presented before the world the new development philosophy, moving from resilience to prosperity through MUJI plan. But now how to take the momentum forward? Can't we collaborate with our fellow Climate Vulnerable Forum countries and provide them with not only technical but also intellectual support so that they can also move toward prosperity? How can we speed up and get finance to implement the fantastic more than $80 billion program or plan called investment plan called MUJI plan? Can't we once again set another example as we did in 2010 when we established by putting together our domestic revenue and established the Climate Change Trust Fund to implement the Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan? My second point would be now the country is developing or preparing its national budget 2022-23. I take this moment and urge the government of Bangladesh to establish Biodiversity Conservation Fund. You may say that it is a new thing, you can't do it in next 4 months or so. No, it is not a new thing I'm talking about. Bangladesh actually created the provision under Bangladesh Biodiversity Act back in 2017. Nothing have, as far as I know, nothing has been done to materialize that. If we can create this national funding mechanism, it will be a fantastic milestone of Bangladesh's leadership in implementing COP26 decision. Why I'm saying that? Because nature-based solution has been considered one of the effective ways to take ambitious long-term actions against climate change. So this Biodiversity Conservation Fund therefore can help us to tackle not only one crisis, but 2 simultaneously. Climate crisis, obviously, but also biodiversity loss. We can't separate these together. And before the COVID-19 hit the world, in November 2019, our parliament actually appreciated that fact and adopted a motion called planetary emergency. So we need to think that actively, how to create this fund. Now, the final point I would like to make is definitely we are still passing through the COVID pandemic, and there are lots of challenge along with climate challenge. And we all know that how devastating it was back in 2020. Within 9 months, first 9 months of COVID pandemic, Bangladesh's poverty became double from 21 to 42%, which actually crushed all our achievement. But Bangladesh turned back. And we are expecting that by this June, we will be able to push down the poverty level back to the pre-COVID period. So we will be losing 2 years of our achievement. But nature-based solution, conservation, restoration of the ecosystem can help us to make economic recovery after a crisis or a disaster. We saw that after different natural disasters and after disaster or when we are getting prepared for the future disaster under the climate change scenario. And there are global evidence all over the world, and there are many organizations advocating for how economic recovery can be linked with nature-based solutions. International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, ILO, and many others have gathered evidence. Yes, we need to do something about it. And I would like to, in my third point, I would like to urge the concerned Bangladeshi ministries to incorporate economic recovery potentials of nature-based solutions in our post-disaster rebuilding plans, when we try to build back better, as well as post-pandemic recovery plan. Very interestingly, the MUJI plan is probably one of the first documents that appreciates such potentials through employment generation, through nature conservation, which is amazing. So can't we take these plans, the revised one, the updated one, and the implementation story to the COP27 in Egypt in November this year? Finally, as I conclude, indeed, the COVID has delayed our graduation from the LDC status by a few years. But we should use this additional time to change our mindset as well. We need to move forward being called the adaptation capital of the world, or adaptation leader, or adaptation teacher. I would love to see Bangladesh being more vocal globally and amazingly aggressive to raise funds for its prosperity and other development plans. It is great to see that my country is annually, despite the COVID, annually spending more than 4% of its annual budget, almost 0.75% of GDP to tackle climate change. But how long should we receive external funding just to prepare our national adaptation plan or updating our Bangladesh climate change strategy and action plan? We need to be aggressive to funding our climate plans. What is stopping us desperately starting that before COP27? That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Irfanullah, for your well thought out and informative remarks today. With this webinar coming to a close, I would like to extend a special thanks to His Excellency, Mr. Robert Chatterton Dickson, for his valuable and brilliant participation and support. We have a long history of collaboration between Cosmos Foundation and the British High Commission. On behalf of UNB, I would like to thank all our distinguished speakers and discussants who have each provided a unique, incisive, and insightful deliberation on climate crisis. In conclusion, may we join our hands in applauding this very successful event. Wishing you all good health and all the best.